Hi there, thank you so much for all your likes, views and indeed subscriptions from the last video. What we're going to do today is find out a little bit more about Hinduism and an extraordinary figure called Gandhi. So we're not going to be able to look at every single aspect of his life, but let's just see if we can pick out a few key things. So he was born in 1869 in India, and India was part of the British Empire. The British had conquered a quarter of the globe at that time and had under its control Canada, New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, and of course India. And a huge part of India's contribution to the empire was tea and cotton, which basically meant that India was propping up financially the British Empire in so many ways. Gandhi wasn't born into a very, very poor family. I think probably the equivalent would be sort of a lower middle class. And he was privileged to have an education, and he studied law in England. Apparently he loved ballroom dancing, and also went to study to be practice his law in South Africa. He returned to India. And one of the things that struck him when he of his time in South Africa was seeing the divisions based along racial lines there, and that's something that really influenced him. And when he returned to India, what he wanted to do was to work on allowing the Indians themselves to have governance of their own country. And from 1918, that's when he began a campaign against the British who were ruling India. He wasn't anti-British, he was pro-Indian democracy. And he got his nickname Mahatma at that time, which means the great soul. And he had a very strong belief that what India should be self-governing and have a right to democracy. And one of the things he did in his big campaign to get India independence was something called the salt marches. Now, salt is something we take for granted. Okay, it's on our tables, we put it on our fish and chips. But salt is hugely important. It adds flavouring to your food, and also it can act as a preservative. You can rub it into meat and it absorbs all the moisture, and it helps to keep it for a long time. So it's very, very important to the community in India at the time. And there was a tax on the salt. And what he did is that he led hundreds of thousands of people for a march to the coast, about 248 miles, I think he walked, picking up people along the way. And there you may have done this experiment where in science, where you take some salt water and you boil it and you evaporate it and there's the salt left, so forth. And so this really annoyed the British. And as a result, 60,000 people were arrested because the tax on salt was a huge source of income. But I think this tells us something very interesting about Gandhi and his approach, because he used the concept of ahimsa, which is a really crucial idea in the Hindu faith. It's avoidance of violence and respect for all living things. In the Hindu faith, all living things have an Atman, which is translate roughly into English as a soul. So what that basically means is that when an animal passes away or a human passes away, that Atman, that soul, then might migrate into another living thing. If it doesn't, then it's achieved moksha, which is the release from samsara. Samsara is reincarnation, the birth and cycle of life. So it was very, very keen to have this policy of ahimsa. And I guess also, if you think about it, it gives one the moral high ground as well. So when thinking about and reflecting upon Hinduism, it's not just about respecting life as it is, it's also thinking about it spiritually in a fourth dimension, as it were. That your Atman, your soul, is a very significant part and should be looked after and valued. Others as well. So that was something that was very, very important. Another thing to think about as well is that, and by the way, I'm cutting lots out of the story, is that after World War II, Britain decided to divide India into two separate countries. So yes, India would get its independence, India and Pakistan, but Gandhi was strongly opposed to this idea. But in many ways, his hand was forced on this because of threats of violence. And it caused a huge amount of tension and a huge amount of loss of life. In many ways, it was very badly organised by the British. But I think what's particularly interesting is how, as the father of modern India in many ways, he was seen as someone who tried to heal those divisions. And when there was conflict happening, he did try to go on hunger strike and refused to take anything until the warring factions, had actually taken a break, as it were. But I think what's particularly interesting about Gandhi is a couple of his quotes. And one of my favourites is this: "An eye for an eye makes the whole world blind." And something you might want to think about is, what does Gandhi mean by this? Well, obviously he's riffing on and taken a quote, another religious quote, which is often misquoted and taken out of context, and that's important to bear in mind. But I think it ties in with this whole idea of ahimsa as well, and it's very telling just to play around with and reflect upon. An eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. Another of his quotes was this: "Be the change you want to see in the world." And for me, one of the things to come out of this, and you will have different interpretations, is this idea, well, there may be things that you're dissatisfied with. Well, don't wait for someone else to change it. Why don't you get involved and start making a difference? Of course, cruelly, Gandhi himself was eventually assassinated by a fanatic, and he never got to see how India sort of panned out after it gained its independence. But his legacy still lives today. And one person who in particular was greatly influenced was Martin Luther King. Now, he was a famous Christian activist who worked in the mid 1900s of the last century for civil rights for African Americans. He was hugely influenced by Gandhi's idea of ahimsa, and I think that in many ways is the legacy of this extraordinary Hindu teacher, Mahatma Gandhi. So, as always, thank you so much for your time. As always, amongst yourselves, feel free to comment, and of course, if you wish to like and subscribe, but most importantly, enjoy your learning.